At the galaxy's edge, where stars bleed red and the void swallows hope, a spark flares, a battered ship, a stolen soul, and a fight to claim what the dark denies. From the ashes of Vyris Outpost to the dust of a nameless moon, Kael Torren and Arynn defy the chains of fate, igniting a war against a shadow that never sleeps. In a universe of wreckage and ruin, their rebellion burns, a fragile flame daring to forge a haven from the abyss. Love the spark? Hit that like, sub to the alien whispers. Join the fight. The galaxy's edge was a jagged scar, torn across the void, and Vyris Outpost festered at its center. A decaying sprawl of salvaged metal and shattered dreams orbiting the husk of a neutron star. Kael Torren stepped onto the ash-dusted deck, the air hitting him like a wall of scorched wiring and stale regret. Beyond the cracked viewport, the red dwarf pulsed faintly, its crimson light bleeding through the station's skeletal frame, painting jagged shadows across the walls. The drift spire, his weather-beaten cargo hauler, had barely survived its last hyperspace jump, its engines choking on their own fumes, its hull trembling with every shift. He needed a gravitic regulator to stitch her back together, and Vyris Outpost was his last resort, a graveyard where the desperate bartered with the damned. A guttural roar ripped through the silence, raw and alive, reverberating off the station's fractured corridors. Kael's hand dropped to the pulse rifle at his hip, scarred fingers curling around the grip as his pulse kicked up a notch. It wasn't a machine's death throes. Something out there was fighting or dying. He wasn't here to play hero, wasn't here to chase ghosts, but the sound gnawed at him, stirring memories he'd buried deep. Torren screams, faint and fading, echoing from a slaver's hold years ago. Kael shook it off, forcing his focus back to the present. The drift spire needed him alive, not lost in the past. His guide, HFY, shuffled ahead, a wiry scavenger with cybernetic eyes glowing a sickly green in the dimness. "Move it," HFY rasped, his voice a mechanical buzz from a throat half rebuilt with circuits. "It's down this way." Kael followed, the tunnel narrowing around them, its walls slick with condensation and pulsing faintly from the star's residual heat. The air grew heavier, thick with the tang of molten slag, and something sharper. Fear, maybe, or desperation. HFY's silence was unsettling, his cyber eyes darting to shadowed corners. But Kael pressed on. The drift spire was counting on him, her flickering systems a constant hum in his mind, urging him deeper into this pit. The passage opened into a cavernous chamber. A gutted reactor core turned bizarre, its ceiling draped with tattered banners that swayed in the draft of failing ventilators. Flickering plasma lamps cast uneven light across the floor, illuminating a crude stage cobbled from salvaged beams and rusted plating. A sparse crowd gathered around it. Merchants in shimmering cloaks whispering deals, bounty hunters with grafted limbs clicking against their armor, and insectoid traders hissing through gleaming mandibles. At the stage's center stood a stasis pod, its translucent shell humming with a faint, electric glow that cut through the gloom like a beacon. Inside was her. Arynn stood motionless, her amber skin shimmering like molten glass, catching the light in waves that seemed to ripple with every flicker of the lamps. Her violet-black hair spilled down her back, luminous strands pulsing faintly as if alive with some hidden current. Her gold eyes, deep, unblinking, stared through the pod's surface, not at the bitters or the squalor, but into a void beyond reach. She was tall, her posture rigid yet graceful, hands clasped before her in a way that spoke of discipline, or perhaps a quiet surrender. Kael's breath caught, sharp and sudden, as memory surged unbidden. Torren's face flashed before him, blood-streaked, pleading, his wrists raw against chains as Kael clawed at the slaver's bars, too late to pull him free. Arynn wasn't Torren, wasn't human, but something in her stillness, her weight of silence, struck the same chord deep in his chest. Lot 7. The auctioneer's voice sliced through the haze, amplified by a modulator strapped to his gaunt throat. He was a skeletal figure, half hidden beneath a hood, his bony fingers twitching over a control slate. Zoran cast, unmodded. Exiled elite, single prior claimant. Skilled in navigation, engineering, and adaptive service. Compliance verified. Compliance. The word landed like a blow, cold and bitter. Kael's jaw tightened as the bidding erupted. A towering cyborg with a hydraulic arm barked to summon credits, his voice a low rumble. A masked smuggler countered with a cache of rare isotopes, her tone clipped and sharp. An insectoid trader hissed a promise of untraceable tech, mandibles clicking in rhythm. The numbers climbed, voices tangling in a clamor of greed, but Kael barely registered them. His eyes were locked on Arynn, her silence deafening amidst the chaos. She wasn't trembling, wasn't pleading, just standing there, a statue of amber and shadow, her presence pulling at something raw inside him. He'd seen that look before, that hollow strength, in Torren's eyes before the slavers dragged him away. It was the look of someone who'd lost everything but hadn't yet broken. Kael had no plan, no credits to spare. The Driftspire's reserves were tapped, and he was down to his last scraps. His hand brushed the satchel at his side, tools, coils, a cracked holodisc. And then, with a pang that felt like ripping open an old wound, he reached for the pendant around his neck. An obsidian shard threaded with wire, its edges smoothed by years of restless touch. It was the last piece of Torren he'd salvaged from that blood-soaked hold. Worthless to anyone else, it was his anchor, his guilt, his vow to never fail again. The crowd's murmurs grew as he stepped forward, their sneers a dull roar in his ears. "I'll top the last bid," he said, his voice cutting through the din like a blade. Laughter erupted, harsh, biting, but he ignored it, dumping his satchel onto the stage. A plasma cutter clattered out, followed by a tangle of spare coils and the holodisc, its faint light winking in the gloom. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, he unhooked the pendant and placed it atop the pile, the obsidian catching the plasma glow like a dark star. "This is all I've got," he said, meeting the auctioneer's modulated gaze. "Take it or leave it." The chamber fell silent, the air thick with disbelief. The auctioneer's modulator word, a mechanical hum that stretched the moment taut, his hooded eyes flicking from the meager offering to Kael's unyielding stare. The cyborg shifted, his arm hissing with hydraulics. The smuggler's hand twitched toward a concealed blade. Kael stood firm, his heart pounding, but his face a mask. He didn't know why he'd done it. Instinct, desperation, a ghost's whisper, but he wouldn't back down. Not now. Sold, the auctioneer snapped, the word final as a gunshot. The crowd muttered, some in disbelief, others in scorn, but Kael didn't care. The stasis pod hissed as its seals released, the hum fading into a soft whine. Arynn stepped out. No chains, no hesitation, her bare feet silent against the rusted stage. She crossed the platform with steady grace, stopping beside him, close enough that he could feel the faint warmth radiating from her amber skin. Her gold eyes locked onto his, and for the first time he saw something shift in them. Not fear, not gratitude, but a storm held in check, a fury and resilience woven into their depths. "Who are you?" he asked, the words slipping out before he could stop them, low enough that only she could hear. She tilted her head slightly, her violet-black hair shifting like a living shadow. "Arynn," she said, her voice low and resonant, like a hum from the void itself. It wasn't just a name. It was a claim, a shard of identity reclaimed from whatever had bound her to that pod. She didn't elaborate, didn't flinch, just held his gaze as if testing him. Kael nodded toward the tunnel. "Come on." She followed, her steps matching his, and the crowd parted reluctantly, their whispers trailing like smoke. JYX's cyber eyes burned into Kael's back as they left, a silent warning or curiosity. He couldn't tell. The journey back to the Driftspire was a blur, the station's shadows stretching around them, alive with unseen eyes. The hatch clanged shut behind them, sealing out Vyris's decay, and Kael exhaled, the sound ragged in the ship's familiar hum. Arynn stood in the cargo bay, a cluttered hollow of crates and dangling cables, her gold eyes scanning the space with quiet intensity. Kael turned to her, the weight of his choice settling in. "You're not a captive," he said, his voice rougher than he intended. "I don't own you. You can leave whenever you want." She looked at him, then, really looked, her gaze piercing through the dimness. "Leave?" she echoed, the word hanging between them. "To where?" He had no answer, his mind still reeling from the auction, from her presence. "There's a bunk," he said finally. "It's rough, but it's yours if you want it. No streams punto." A long silence stretched, taut and heavy, before she spoke again. "Arynn," she repeated, softer this time, as if tasting the name. She nodded once, a single, deliberate motion, then turned and slipped into the ship's dim corridors, vanishing into its depths. Kael stood alone, the bay's silence pressing against him. It wasn't the empty quiet he'd grown used to. This was alive, charged with something he couldn't name. He'd acted on impulse, driven by a memory he couldn't shake, but now what? The drift spire hummed around him, a battered refuge, and Arynn was here, a stranger tied to him by nothing but a reckless bid. He didn't know what he'd started, didn't know what she carried in those gold eyes, but as the red dwarf's light faded beyond the viewport, he felt the galaxy shift, a subtle tilt towards something new, something dangerous, something he couldn't turn back from. The drift spire cut through the void, its engines growling with a defiance that echoed Kael's own. Vyris Outpost was a distant blur, lost to the black, but the ship's systems flashed warnings. The missing gravitic regulator left them teetering on the edge of collapse. Kael sat in the cockpit, hands resting on the controls, his mind tracing the reckless choice that had brought Arynn aboard. It wasn't regret, not exactly, just a weight he hadn't yet measured. A sharp clang rang from the aft, snapping him out of his thoughts. He stood, pulse rifle at his hip, and moved through the ship's patched corridors, the hum of machinery guiding his steps. The sound came again, metal striking metal, intentional. He entered the engine bay, a maze of pipes and glowing conduits, and found Arynn there, crouched by a thruster housing. She wielded a calibration tool with steady hands, adjusting a valve until the faint hiss of pressure evened out. She didn't glance up as he approached. "It was off balance," she said, her voice low and firm, cutting through the bay's drone. "Would have failed mid-jump." Kael stopped a few paces away, watching her work. "You didn't need to bother," he said, keeping his tone even. "This ship's my mess." She rose, turning to him, her gold eyes locking onto his with quiet intensity. "It's not about need," she said. "It's about not dying. You gave me that shot. I'm taking it." Her words carried a resolve that resonated with him, a mirror to his own refusal to give up. He nodded, stepping closer to check the thruster. "You've got a knack for this," he said. "Where'd that come from?" "Necessity," she replied, her tone clipped but not harsh. "When you're a tool, you learn to fix what's broken, or you're discarded." The word tool hung there, a shard of her past piercing the air. Kael's jaw tightened, a faint echo of memories stirring, chains a hold, a loss, but he pushed it down, focusing on her. "You're not that here," he said, holding her gaze. "Not with me." She studied him for a moment, then turned back to the thruster, brushing hair from her face with a quick motion. "That's a start," she said, her voice softening just enough to hint at trust. Kael moved to a console nearby, pulling up the system stats. The thruster's output stabilized, a small win against the ship's decay. "We're still on borrowed time," he said, half to himself. "No regulator means the next jump's a dice roll." "Then we get one," she said, stepping beside him to scan the screen. The bay's tight quarters brought her close, her arm pressed against his as she leaned in, a warm, steady pressure that sent a quiet heat curling through him, like an ember catching in dry grass. Her hair brushed his shoulder, her scent, faint like earth after a storm, slipping into his senses. Kael froze, the contact stirring a raw awareness, not loud or sharp, but deep and tugging. She didn't pull away immediately, her focus still on the readouts, her closeness lingering before she straightened, breaking the moment. Kael exhaled, his pulse a steady thrum, and forced his eyes back to the console. "Where?" she asked, her voice unchanged, as if the touch hadn't registered. He cleared his throat, steadying himself. "Terran's Veil," he said. "Smuggler's Moon. I know someone there who might have a regulator. If we can slip past the scavengers." Her eyes narrowed slightly. "Scavengers?" "Vultures," he said. "And worse. Terran's a den. Move quick or get picked clean." She nodded, a flicker of steel in her expression. "I can keep up." Kael watched her, the way she stood, unshaken, carving her place in the Driftspire's chaos. "Good," he said, turning back to the corridor. "We jump at 0600. Rest if you can." He started to leave, but her voice cut through. "You're not like them," she said, clear and quiet. He turned, meeting her gaze. "Boo, the bitters," she said. "They saw a prize. You saw something else." Kael's hand brushed the empty space at his neck, a reflex from a weight no longer there. "I don't like seeing things locked up," he said. A faint curve touched her lips, not quite a smile, but close. "That's enough for now," she said, then returned to the thruster, her hands moving with calm purpose. Kael left the bay. The Driftspires hummed steady around him as he headed back to the cockpit. She was right. He'd traded something dear to cut her free, but it wasn't just about the past. Arynn was a choice, a shift in the void's endless dark. As he sank into the pilot's chair, the stars stretching ahead, the ship felt less like a tomb, lighter, somehow, under her quiet strength. The Driftspire lurched out of hyperspace, its frame rattling as it slipped into the shadow of Terran's Veil, a scarred moon orbiting a gas giant's skeletal remains. Kael steadied the controls, guiding the ship through a jagged approach, the viewport framing the moon's pocked surface against the swirling amber haze beyond. The jump had pushed the gravitic systems to their limit, warning lights blinking red, but they'd survived. Terran's Veil was their chance at a regulator, a lifeline, if they could outmaneuver its predators. Arynn stood at his side in the cockpit, her gold eyes fixed on the navigation screen, her presence a quiet counterpoint to the ship's strain. She'd been there since the jump, tracking the readouts with a precision that matched his own. "We're holding," she said, her voice cutting through the hum. "Barely." Kael nodded, easing the Driftspire into a docking cavern carved into the moon's black rock. "Terran's a snake pit," he said. "We grab the regulator and bolt. No detours." She glanced at him, her gaze probing. "Your contact. Can we trust her?" "Arynn is sharp," he said. "Pulled her out of a raider mess once. She'll deal if the offer's solid." The ship locked in with a hard clang, clamps securing it to the cavern floor. Kael powered down, grabbing his pulse rifle. "Stay close," he said, heading for the hatch. "This place doesn't forgive mistakes." Arynn followed, her steps silent, her posture taut with readiness. The airlock hissed open, revealing Terran's Veil, a hollow of dark stone lit by stuttering lanterns, the air heavy with rust and fuel. Tunnels twisted away, their walls etched with scars and whispers, the distant clatter of metal echoing through. Kael took the lead, senses sharp, Arynn a steady shadow beside him. They reached Rinna's workshop, a cluttered den where a wiry woman with a prosthetic arm hunched over a sparking coil. She didn't look up, her voice dry over the welder's hiss. "Thought you were scrap, Kael." "Pity, still breathing," he said, leaning against the frame. "Need a gravitic regulator." "You holding?" Rinna dropped the coil, peering at him through a cracked visor. "Got one deep stash." "What's the pay?" "Fusion core," he said. "Half charged, clean. Keeps your lights on." She smirked, her arm whirring as she leaned back. "Slim pickings. Market's tight." Her eyes slid to Arynn, narrowing. "Who's the tag-along?" Kael stepped forward, voice low. "Not your concern. Yes or no?" Rinna held his stare, then jerked her head. "Deep tunnels. Regulators there. Move fast." She paused, lowering her voice. "Words out, Kael. Bounty on a Zoran runaway. Elite cast, big credits. Description fits her." Kael's stomach nodded, but he kept his expression flat. "Thanks," he said, turning away. Rinna's warning trailed after him. Eyes open. "Trouble's close." The tunnel deepened, the air turning cold and thick. Arynn broke the silence, her tone sharp. "They're hunting me." "Seems so," Kael said, scanning ahead. "Zoran Elite. That's you?" She stopped, forcing him to face her. She said, her gold eyes burning. "I was born to the High Lattice, rulers of Zoran Prime. Trained to command, to obey without question." "I didn't." Kael tilted his head, listening. "What did you do?" "Felt." She said the word raw. "Asked why." "Refused their rituals when they purged the unfit. They called it treason, stripped my rank, sold me to the Ashen Dominion. My own blood signed the order." "Who?" He pressed, the pieces clicking. "High Warden Karath," she said, her voice hardening. "My uncle. He's tying up loose ends. Can't let a defect live free." Kael's grip tightened on his rifle, the weight of her past sinking in. "He won't have you," he said. "Not here." Her jaw clenched, but she nodded, and they moved on. The tunnel widened into a storage nook, crates piled high. Kael cracked one open, revealing a regulator, scratched but functional. "There," he said, lifting it. Arynn stepped in to steady it, her hands brushing his as she gripped the crate's edge. Her fingers pressed warm against his, a quiet strength that sent a slow heat coiling through him, like a river carving stone, deep, not loud, but undeniable. She leaned closer, her shoulder aligning with his, her breath a faint warmth near his jaw as she adjusted the load. The closeness held, a steady pull beneath his ribs, before she eased back, securing the regulator. Kael's pulse thumped, but he kept his focus, nodding toward the tunnel. "Let's go." They hauled the crate back, the weight slowing them, when the air shifted, too still, too heavy. Shadows moved ahead, deliberate. Kael dropped the regulator, raising his rifle as three figures stepped out, armored, visored, weapons drawn. "Zoran Exile," the leader rasped, voice mechanical. "Dominion claim. Stand down, pilot." Arynn tensed, her stance shifting. Kael aimed, voice ice. "She's not yours." The hunter sneered. "Karatha's orders, clean slate. You're in over your head." Kael fired, a pulse blast slamming the leader's chest, knocking him back. Arynn darted forward, snatching a shard of metal from the crate and driving it into the second hunter's arm, her strike swift and precise. The third lunged at Kael, but he ducked, smashing his rifle's stock into the visor, shattering it. The fight ended fast. Three bodies slumped, alive but down. Kael grabbed the regulator, Arynn matching his pace as they bolted. "Karath won't stop," she said, her breath steady despite the clash. "Then we don't," he said, the drift spire's hatch in sight. They sealed it shut, Kael dropping into the pilot's seat as the ship roared to life. Arynn stood beside him, hand braced on the console, her presence solid. "You didn't need to take that hit," she said, quieter now. "Wasn't a choice," he replied, meeting her eyes. "We're tied in this." Her lips curved faintly, a rare softness breaking through. "We are," she said, and the drift spire leapt into the void, Terran's veil fading behind them. The drift spire eased away from Terran's veil, its engines thrumming low as it slipped into the boundless black. The moon's rough silhouette faded into the gas giant's amber haze, the memory of Hunter's visors glinting in the tunnels still sharp in Kael's mind. The regulator rested secure in the cargo bay, a hard-earned lifeline, but the ship's pulse felt tenuous, a fragile thread stretched tight. Kael guided them deeper into the void, his hands steady on the controls, plotting a course to outrun the echoes of pursuit. Arynn stood at the cockpit's edge, her gold eyes scanning the starfield, her presence a quiet counterweight to the ship's restless hum. The fight had left her unmarked but taut, her fingers flexing as if testing the air. "They'll hunt the jump trails," she said, her voice slicing through the stillness. "Karath is too thorough." "Then we vanish," Kael replied, his tone firm. "Go dark, drift off their grid. Buy us a window." She nodded, a slight shift of her head, and Kael steered toward a debris field, a sprawling tomb of cracked moons and twisted wrecks, relics of a war long silenced. The drift spire wove into the chaos, its sensors muted as it tucked behind a mangled hull, blending into the ruin. The viewport framed a jagged shard of rock, its edges catching faint starlight, a shield against the Dominion's reach. Kael powered down, the cockpit falling into a dense quiet. Arynn settled into the co-pilot's seat, her posture easing slightly, though her eyes stayed sharp. "This stillness," she said, her voice low. "It's a lie out here." "Best lie we've got," he said, leaning back, the chair creaking under him. "Keeps us breathing." She tilted her head, studying him. "You breathe like it's a fight," she said, her tone probing but not harsh. "Every pull's a defiance." Kael met her gaze, a faint smirk tugging at his lips. "Habit," he said. "Void doesn't give anything easy." Her eyes narrowed, but a spark flickered in them. Something alive, curious. "It's not habit," she said. "It's hunger. You're chasing something bigger than this ship." The words landed sharp, peeling back a layer he hadn't aimed. Kael shifted, his hand resting on the console, fingers tapping once. "Maybe," he said, "or maybe I just don't like being cornered." Arynn leaned forward, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "I know that hunger," she said. "I felt it when they stripped me bare. High lattice, Zorn Prime. Karath called it cleansing. I called it theft. I've been chasing it back ever since." Kael held her stare, the cockpit's dim light carving her features into something fierce, unyielding. "And now," he asked, his voice quieter, drawn in. "Now I've got teeth," she said, her lips curving, not a smile but a blade's edge. "And you're sharpening them." The air thickened, a shared current running through it. Kael stood, breaking the moment, and gestured toward the engine bay. "Let's make sure those teeth bite," he said. "Regulators waiting." They moved aft, the regulator a heavy shadow among the crates. Kael knelt, cracking open a panel, his hand steady but his heart unsteady under her nearness. Arynn pulled tools with a quiet grace, her movements sure as she handed him a wrench. Their fingers met, not a fleeting brush, but a firm clasp, her warmth folding into his like a vow, unspoken. She stepped closer to thread a conduit, her presence a steady flame beside him, her shoulder pressing against his as they worked in sync. It wasn't just the task binding them. It was something fiercer, a trust forged in shared scars, a bond that didn't need words. She locked the system in, and Kael tightened the final bolt, the regulator humming alive as if echoing the pulse between them. He looked at her, and in her gold eyes he saw not just a partner, but a fire that matched his own, unyielding, alive theirs. "Set," she said, standing, the bay's glow catching her in stark relief. Kael rose, wiping his hands, the ship's rhythm stronger now. "Buys us time," he said, his voice rough with focus. "What's Karatha's next play?" "Relays," she said, her tone hardening. "He'll ping every hub till he finds us. Kyra Expanse has 1, Dominion Outpost. 2 jumps out. We hit it. We blind him." Kael tilted his head, the plan clicking. "Big swing," he said. "We'll need a hideout first. Somewhere dead, off their scopes." "Dead zone's close," she said. "Old mining rigs gutted. We drift there, prep." He nodded, the path forming. "We hold here a day, let the heat fade, then go." Arynn agreed, and they returned to the cockpit. The debris field stretched beyond, a silent shroud of ruin. Kael sank into his seat, Arynn beside him, the quiet settling like dust. "You're not what I expected," she said suddenly, her voice soft but cutting. He glanced at her, eyebrow raised. "What did you expect?" "A scavenger," she said. "Someone who takes, not someone who builds." Kael let out a low breath, her words sinking deep. "I'm no builder," he said. "Just too damn stubborn to break." She leaned closer, her gold eyes locked on his. "That's how things start," she said, her voice a quiet fire. "Stubbornness, then teeth." The cockpit held them, a fragile pause in the void's endless churn. Arynn stood, her gold eyes catching his, a storm brewing in their depths. She stepped toward him, not away, her arm pressing against his chest. Not a fleeting weight, but a spark that flared into a blaze. Kael rose, drawn in, and they crashed together, lips meeting like two rivers colliding, fierce and inevitable, a torrent swallowing the silence. The stars beyond blurred as they surrendered, their hands tracing paths without words, a dance of shadow and flame folding into one. It wasn't a clash, but a weaving, a tapestry spun from steel and ash, their edges melting into the dark. No boundaries remained, only a quiet fusion, like a moon pulling tides or a hole bending to the void's embrace. She didn't fade down a corridor. They stayed, tangled in the wreckage of their own making, raw, whole, carved from the drift. Kael sank back after, the stars glinting sharp, Karatha's shadow a distant murmur. Here, in this fleeting harbor, they'd claimed something, small, fierce theirs. The drift spire hung in the debris-filled silence, a fleeting refuge after Terran's veil. 2 days of quiet had steadied their nerves, but Kael knew it wouldn't last. Karatha's hunters were out there, relentless. He stood in the cockpit, hands on the controls, the starfield a cold expanse beyond the viewport. The regulator kept the ship alive, its hum a steady pulse, but Arynn's plan burned brighter. Strike the Dominion relay, blind their trackers, carve a chance to breathe. Arynn stepped beside him, her gold eyes locked on the navigation screen, her voice cutting sharp. Kyra expanse. Relays there, 2 jumps. We take it out, we're ghosts. Kael met her gaze, the weight of it settling in. 1 hit, he said, fast and hard. No second shots. I know their systems, she said, her tone iron. Code's flaws, we'll break it wide open. He punched in the coordinates, the drift spire roaring awake. The first jump twisted the stars into blinding streaks, the second spitting them out at Kyra's edge, a forsaken pocket of space, its silence shattered by the relay's hulking form. A fortress of jagged steel orbited a barren asteroid, its spires bristling with antennae, a dark sentinel pulsing with Dominion power. Kael killed the ship's signature, nudging it closer, fragments of rock drifting past like a shroud. Debris cover, Arynn said, her voice steady. They'll sweep for signals, stay dead. Kael trimmed the thrusters, the drift spire slipping among the asteroid's rubble, a ghost in the chaos. They locked onto a maintenance hatch, the clamps biting in with a dull thud. He grabbed his pulse rifle, Arynn snagging a blade from the cargo bay, her grip sure. Set, he asked. Set, she replied, and they breached the relay's cold heart. The corridors stretched tight, steel walls lined with conduits, blue panels casting stark light. Arynn took point, her steps silent, leading them past the guard. She struck fast, her blade sinking into his side, dropping him without a sound. They hit the core, a vast chamber of towering servers, their hum a low roar, the central console aglow with streams of data. Arynn plugged in a device, her fingers racing across it. I'm rewriting my trace, she said. Then I torch it. Full collapse. Kael stood guard, rifle up, the air thick with strain. Time. 3 minutes, she said, her focus absolute. Vyris is primed. Metal clanged in the distance, boots, heavy and closing. Kael's jaw tightened. They're here, he said. Hurry. She didn't flinch, her hands steady as the screen flared red. The chamber's doors slammed open, 5 Dominion enforcers charging in, armor gleaming, rifles raised, visors dark. Kael fired first, a pulse blast ripping through the lead's chest, his body crumpling in a shower of sparks. Arynn rolled low, her blade slashing his second's knee, toppling him with a grunt. 2 more rushed Kael. He ducked a shot, slamming his rifle stock into one's visor, cracking it, then pivoted, blasting the other point blank. The 5th lunged at Arynn, but she twisted, driving her blade up through his armpit, silencing him. The fight ended fast. 5 down, the floor littered with their groans. Done, Arynn said, yanking her device free. The servers whined, the virus surging. Lights flickered, then died, plunging the core in a shadow pierced by arcing bolts. It's going down. A deep rumble shook the chamber, the floor buckling as the system imploded. Move, Kael shouted, grabbing her arm. They bolted, corridors flashing red, conduits bursting overhead in sprays of molten sparks. The relay groaned, steel tearing apart as they sprinted for the hatch. Behind them, a thunderous crack split the air, the cores collapsed, igniting a chain of blasts. Fireballs roared through the tunnels, licking at their heels, the heat searing as they dove into the drift spire. Kael slammed the controls, the ship lurching free as the relay erupted, a blinding flare of orange and white, steel shredding into the void like a dying star. Shrapnel hammered the hull, the blast shockwave rocking them hard, but the drift spire held, streaking away as the fortress burned out, its remnants scattering across Kyra's dark. Silence fell heavy in the cockpit, the stars steady once more. Kael slumped into his seat, chest heaving, the adrenaline fading slow. "That's our mark," he said, glancing at Arynn. She stood beside him, her breathing even, her gold eyes reflecting the distant glow. "Karatha's blind here," she said. "We've got a gap." He exhaled, the tension easing. "Where next?" "Somewhere free," she said, her voice firm. "A place to root, not drift." Kael nodded, a spark kindling inside him. "Outer Rim's got a moon, nameless, quiet. We can claim it." Her lips curved, a rare light breaking through. "Then we make it ours," she said, the words a quiet vow. The drift spire hummed beneath them, its course locked. They'd torn a hole in Karatha's net, the relay's ruin a testament to their defiance. He lingered out there, a storm unbroken, but they'd won this fight, a foothold towards something solid, something theirs. The drift spire settled into the outer rim, its engines cooling as it touched down on a nameless moon, a quiet speck adrift in the void, unclaimed by maps or Dominion reach. Kael guided it to rest on a flat stretch of gray dust, the hull sinking slightly into the soil, the stars above sharp and alien. Kyra's relay was ash now, a wound carved into Karatha's grip, and this moon was their prize, a chance to stand still after endless running. Arynn stepped out beside him, her gold eyes scanning the barren expanse, her breath misting in the thin air. "No signals," she said, her voice steady. "No trackers. Just us." Kael nodded, the weight of their victory settling in. "Then we make it ours," he said, hefting a crate of salvaged steel from the cargo bay. They worked in tandem, raising a shack from the wreckage, panels bolted tight, a roof angled against the wind. Days blurred into nights, the moon's pale sun marking time as they dug a garden, planting hardy roots in the cracked earth, coaxing life from dust. One dawn, the shack stood firm, its shadow stretching long across the ground. Arynn knelt by the garden, her hands dark with soil, a thin ring glinting on her finger, forged from the relay's melted core, a mark of their defiance. Kael watched her from the doorway, her laughter breaking the silence as a sprout pushed through, a sound raw and free, lighting something deep in his chest. She caught his gaze, standing, brushing dirt from her palms. "You think I'll fade out here?" she teased, her tone light but her eyes fierce. "You're too alive," he said, stepping closer. He pulled her in, their lips meeting, a fierce, burning clash, not soft but alive with everything they'd fought for. The kiss deepened, a fire unbound, carrying them inside the shack's dim walls. There, in the quiet, they surrendered, a weaving of strength and scars, not a loud collision, but a tide folding into itself, seamless and whole. No words marked it, only the hum of their shared breath, a union carved from dust and steel, subtle as the moon's pull on its shadows. She pressed her forehead to his after, her voice a whisper. "Let this hold." "It will," he said, his hand steady on her back. "With you." They stepped outside, the alien stars blazing above, cold and distant yet framing something warm, a shack, a garden of life. Karatha's shadow lingered somewhere beyond, a storm they'd face again, but here they stood, partners, builders, unbroken. The moon stretched silent around them, its dust bearing their mark, a haven forged from the void's edge.